Today is November 17th, 2011, and we are at the office of Mr. Dorman Batson, interviewing him about his military service for the West Virginia Veterans Legacy Project. Dr. Batson, could you please give me your full name as it is listed on your birth certificate?
It's Dorman Charles Batson.
Okay. All right. Do you currently or have you ever had a nickname?
Chuck.
Chuck? Okay. Is that what you would have been known by in the military?
Yes.
Chuck? Okay. Where were you born and raised, sir?
I was born in Steubenville, Ohio, but that's, I lived right across the river from there in Follansbee, West Virginia.
Okay.
And, do you need to know when or?
Well, I have
Okay.
your birthday.
But I grew up in West Virginia.
Okay, I see. All right. What did your parents do for a living?
My father worked in the steel mill. He worked 45 years at the coke works of Wheeling Steel, and my mother, she worked in the steel mill during World War II, but she was a housewife.
Okay. Had your father been involved in the military before?
No, but during the war, he was born in 1908, so he was too young for the First World War, and he was kind of too old for the Second World War. Plus, he had 3 kids. I wasn't born yet. Plus, he worked in a steel company, which was kind of a deferment. But he was an air raid warden, he said, during the war, whatever that was, But I guess they had to, at night, they had to not push coke ovens, and they had to be real careful. People had to close their blinds and stuff, and so he had, I guess, more or less had something to do with that, to make sure everybody was not leaving lights on, so in case the Germans wanted to bomb the United States or something. But he wasn't in the military, no.
Okay. You said it was a steel mill where you worked.
Yeah.
Where was that located at?
I was in Follansbee, West Virginia.
Follansbee. Yeah. And you said that you lived in a little town called?
Follansbee.
Follansbee, okay.
Actually, I was born, across the river, but I lived in Coketown, which was part of the coke plant. There were 20 mill houses that were built in the early 1900s, and they tore them down in the 1960s, but I was born in one of them. Matter of fact, there's a picture of those houses up there in the corner, and I was born in this second house in that second row.
I see, okay.
And that picture was taken in 1950, but everybody in the Follansbee area worked at either Wheeling Steel or Weirton Steel.
Okay. Where did you attend school?
Where did I attend school? High school or?
Well, grade school.
Grade school, I went to Jefferson Grade School, which is in downtown Follansbee, which we lived right across the street from it. When I was 2, we moved out of Coketown to downtown, and so I went to Jefferson's Grade School, and then I went to Follansbee Junior High, and I graduated from Follansbee High School.
Okay.
And you can see it there. It's at the top. Follansbee High School's at the top of there. It's this thing right up there.
Oh, I see.
In the corner, yeah.
Okay. All right. Is there any specific events or anything about your childhood that you'd like to share?
Oh, I had a storybook childhood. I was the youngest of 4 kids, and my sisters were several years older than me, but my mom and dad were, I was their life, and I can remember my dad and I'd either go fishing every day or hunting every day, and then, I loved to play baseball. I always thought that I would play for the Pittsburgh Pirates someday, but that never materialized. But I had a really good childhood, playing ball every day, or just, I had it pretty nice. And so I can remember the important things. I guess it was all about family, Christmas and Thanksgiving and everything. It was just, I lived in a little town where you had lots of friends, and it was just, it was an ideal way to grow up.
Okay. Other than your time in the military, have you always stayed connected pretty much to West Virginia?
Yeah, after I graduated from high school, I went to Marshall University, which was in West Virginia, obviously.
Yes.
And then after that I got drafted, and then when I come out of the service, I got a job at Wheeling Steel, you know, and I was a supervisor at one of the plants for about 10 years, and during that time I started taking classes at WVU at night, and I got an MBA. You know, I worked steady midnight for years and years and years to go to school to get the MBA, and then after finished the MBA, a couple years later, the plant I worked in at Wheeling Steel closed.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously I didn't have a job, and I got a job teaching at Salem College, you know, in 1983, and I stayed there for about 7 years, and so I kept that West Virginia connection, and then when it became Salem Takeo, for some reason I wasn't really thrilled about that, and I should have been, but I took a job in North Carolina, teaching at a small Christian college there in Montreat, and then I really didn't like it, so 5 years later I had a chance to come to Glenville, and I've been here going on 17 years, I believe. So all my life except for the 2 years in the Army and 5 years in North Carolina, I've lived here.
Okay.
And I love it here.
Okay, all right. Well, let's segue into your military service. You said you were drafted, correct?
Right.
In 1970.
Right.
Okay. Is there any feelings that you had about that at that time? I mean...
Well, no, I was a very conservative person, and I wasn't going to question the war. That was a kind of a controversial thing, the draft, but my name meant more to me, the name than anything, and I would never question my patriotism. But I got drafted. I was in the first lottery, and I think my number was 129, and they predicted they were going to go to about 270 that first year. And I got drafted, and it was right after Kent State. And so when we took our Army physical, I was going to school at Marshall in Huntington, they picketed our bus and threw tomatoes at us and everything else. And and I took the Army physical in Ashland, Kentucky. And I was one of the few that passed. It seemed like everybody had something wrong with them but me. But then when I come back, I had 4 job interviews or 5. And nobody would hire me because I was going to get drafted. And I had 3 or 4 with Wheeling Steel to be a salesperson because I worked there, in the summers and my dad. And then I got drafted on August 24th, 1970. But I have no regrets. I was scared, obviously, but I have no regrets. That, I'm no better than anybody else, and and I needed to. I never even thought about it. Not that's just the way it was. I just had to go spend a couple years in the service, and there was nothing wrong with that.
Okay. You were drafted into the Army, correct?
Right.
Would you have, if you had a choice, would you have chosen any other branch?
No, I really didn't. When we got, I had left Wellsburg, West Virginia, I think 5 a.m. on this 24th, and they took us to the federal building in Pittsburgh, like 30 people from that Brooke County, and there was hundreds of us up at the federal building in Pittsburgh, and they lined us up in big long lines, and they said count by 4s, and everybody that was a 4, they say take 1 step forward, you're now a member of the United States Marines, and I don't remember what my number was, but I was a 1, 2, or 3, and we were members of the United States Army, and that was the only choice I had, and I didn't have much of a choice. I guess I got to trade at somebody if they didn't want to be in one of those other branches, but I just got put. I think it was just the Army, and the 1s, 2s, and 3s were, or Army, and the 4s were Marines. I don't think they were drafting people in the Navy or the Air Force, but I wouldn't swear to that. But that's how it came about that I was in the Army, and and it wasn't bad. I had a cousin that I never really knew, but he got killed in World War II. I never really thought about the service. Nothing wrong with it, but I didn't. I never planned to make a career out of it. So I just was drafted, and I went.
Okay. Where did you attend your basic training at?
At Fort Dix, New Jersey. That was my first airplane ride. That day when we left Pittsburgh, we eventually got on an airplane, and we flew into Newark, New Jersey, and then they bussed us into Fort Dix, and that was the longest day, kind of, because my name began with a B, my last name, so I was on KP before I even got my Army gear and stuff. And, but I went to Fort Dix, New Jersey, yeah.
I see. All right. How did you feel about your basic training? I mean, is there anything you'd like to say about that?
No, it was hard, but I'd played sports in high school, so I was used to discipline. I didn't think it was any. As a matter of fact, and I've told this story many times, that last summer that I was working wheeling steel because I couldn't get a professional job because I was getting drafted and I just was an hourly worker. I lost more weight working in the coke works, not the coke works, but the blast furnaces than I lost in basic training. So basic training was hard, but it wasn't really that hard of a deal. I mean, it was mentally challenging because you were away from home and you kind of didn't have any rights for that first month or two. You had no free time, but it really wasn't all that bad, and you learned a lot, and I had no bad memories. I made a lot of good friends, and everybody was drafted, and everybody just took it well, and we just all just became friends, and we did what we were told. So yeah, that basic training wasn't bad at all.
Okay. What was your first memorable assignment after basic?
Well, I got sent to the AIT, the advanced training, and I got put in the military police, the MPs, and so I think, I left Fort Dix, and it was bitter cold up in New Jersey, and we had our winter Army heavy stuff, and we flew to Fort Gordon, Georgia, I think on January the 10th or something in 1971 or whatever, and as soon as we got down there, again, there was like a foot of snow, and since my name began with a B, again, I got put on a snow shoveling detail to get from the barracks to where you ate and everything, but it wasn't bad, and I liked Fort Gordon. It was I'm getting my stories mixed up. That's when I left Fort Gordon and I went to my first duty station where the snow detail. But going to Fort Gordon, it was just really hot, and we got down there, and at Fort Dix we had nice brick buildings, and then when we got to Fort Gordon we were in old white frame buildings that weren't very nice. That's the one thing I remember. But again, it wasn't bad. And I enjoyed. AIT, the MP thing. I liked that.
Okay. What were some of the duties that pertain to that?
Well, to make a short story long or something, before too long when I was there, they asked for volunteers, and you've heard never volunteer for anything. Well, I volunteered, and the company clerk needed somebody to help him with some typing. And so I started to work with the company clerk, and that got me out of several duties that I didn't have to do, like certain kind of marches if he really needed me and stuff. And I really enjoyed that, and I worked with him, and I got to know a lot of people that way, and got out of a lot of KP. We had a very small company, like 140 people, and you'd be on that KP by every other week and because I was helping him, he would always get me the days I had to do KP, and so I could just help him, and so I really enjoyed that, and to tell you the truth, we went home for Christmas, and we had like a week or two to come back. I was the only person in my company that knew where I was going to go as my permanent duty station, because he told me, he said, I'm not allowed to tell you this, but since you're the clerk and you help me. And out of my company of 140 people, I think 138 of them went to RVM, Republic of Vietnam. And I was one that stayed in the States, and then there was another fellow that stayed in the state. We both went to West Point, and had nothing to do with me helping him, because those orders come out of Washington or something. But it was, that was a memorable thing, and I probably shouldn't say this part, but they listed your IQs or GS scores by your name, had everybody's name in the middle of in your platoon or whatever, or in your company. And they had all those scores, and the two highest scores were the two that stayed in the state. So I'm not saying that they sent, I don't know if that was the reason. Maybe because I'd never been in trouble, and you had to have to be an MP you had to have a security clearance, but to go to West Point you weren't even part of the Department of Army, you were part of the Department of Defense when you went there. They were really particular, I guess, who they sent there. Everybody had a college degree that I knew at West Point that was in the service there, and so that could have been part of it.
Okay. While you were at West Point, what were some of your duties?
Well, I guarded Nixon's car. I saluted Omar Bradley one time. I was in honor guards for the Emperor of Upper Volta and every dignitary, you know, with the red carpet stuff, and I was in a million funerals. If you knew how many times, like, we would take a group of us up to Poughkeepsie or someplace around West Point, and when somebody got killed in Vietnam, and we would do a little ceremony, you know, a volley of the shots, and we would fold the flag, and I can probably remember 25 times I folded the flag and handed it to somebody that lost their son or husband in the war, and so there were some of the duties. Mainly it was just MP duties. We were on motor patrols, we were on walking patrols. Another thing that I volunteered for, they say never volunteer, but since I could type a little bit, I became like a desk clerk too. And part of the reason is at West Point you broke starch every day, and if you were the desk you didn't have to do that, and so somebody said, well, why don't you do that? You can. So I did that, and so that was part of my duties. Like during football games, when West Point would have football games, they always put me on the desk with the sergeant, no matter what turn you were on, because I was pretty good at doing all those blotter entries and all those journal entries and stuff in the thing. And I remember the silver depositories in West Point, and every hour you had to call them and ask if everything's okay. You know, 255, this is 250, is everything okay? Over, and that was one of the duties. You had to make sure you called the silver depository, or where they checked in, or they'd be sending people there. And but West Point would be just probably like any other post. You had guys that would get out drinking too much, and you'd have to go and kind of, you know, but it was very, very, I liked it. I fired the cannon at Trophy Point. I folded or raised the flag at Trophy Point, which is, you know, you go back hundreds of years of tradition there and stuff. And so, you know, every evening we got to do that, and a lot of times I would be the person that would get to do that, you know, not over a year. You did it maybe 10 times, but it was, I liked that. Yeah.
When you mentioned dignitaries coming and a president, you mentioned it had visited once when you were there.
Yeah, he gave the commencement address, and so we had to guard his bubble top Lincoln, and he never even drove in it. He went in a convertible because it was a pretty day, but we had to take care, make sure nobody stuck a bomb in it or something, but they kept it at the MP station, and I was on duty that night, and he just had to make sure nobody went in there. It's not like a, you know, but.
Were you aware when dignitaries were coming? I mean,
oh yeah. Yeah, we knew. You know, we were on extra duty, although I'm sure they had FBI agents and everybody else on the rooftops, and you know, they really did it well. Another thing I can remember about West Point, every one of those guys got married in June week, and I remember we had to work like 20-some straight days because of all those weddings. You'd have to direct traffic and do all kinds of extra stuff because of the, you know, all the wedding ceremonies and things, and you know, that was in the same chapel that Benedict Arnold did his treasons. I mean, there's a lot of tradition at West Point, but that was but I just kind of remember things like that. And, but yeah, I mean, I forget your last question, but I think I answered it right.
Oh yeah. Okay. You knew how long you were going to be in the military, correct?
Well, 2 years, but then Vietnam was starting to kind of wind down, and they gave us an early out of, I think, like 3 or 4 months. And that was a funny thing because they just said, now, everybody's going to ETS here, and you had to take care of things. And like I had 4 wisdom teeth. This is a dumb thing, but I planned before I got out of the service to have them taken care of while I was in the Army. So I went to the dentist the day we found out we were only going to be in there a couple more weeks, and they said the only day we can do it's right now. So they pulled all 4 of my wisdom teeth, and they cut my tongue, and I couldn't swallow for about a week, and had to live on chocolate pudding and Jello, I think, and you had to put your own self in the. But that's just a memory I had from there.
Okay.
But yeah, I feel, and you probably asked me that, kind of guilty because, like, I had lots of friends that were in Vietnam, and I was running around directing traffic at football games, and I felt bad about that, but it had nothing to do with it. I was did what I was supposed to do, and
Okay.
tried to stay out of trouble best I could.
All right. What was it like to return back to West Virginia after your service?
Oh, it was, it was good. It was kind of like I never left. My mother worried about me, and there were lots of people that, worried about me. When I came back, I had some buddies in the Army, and we talked about, let's visit every state, let's do this. And I got back on a Friday, and I went and put in my application at Wheeling Steel on Monday, and I started to work that same day, I think, and then got into their management trainee program. So I didn't have any transition problems or anything, and so it wasn't hard to come back, because I probably had it as good in West Point as I would have at home. It wasn't. That was another thing that I didn't mention, but every Tuesday they would take a bus from West Point down to New York City, and I saw every Broadway play there was, from Fiddler on a Roof to Jesus Christ Superstar to everything, because the USO would have. So my buddies and I would go to New York about once a week and walk around in the downtown, and so that was, that's a memory that I'll never. I've been everywhere in New York, from the Statue of Liberty, the Empire State Building, to you name it, Wall Street, and that. I don't know if that has anything to do with your military thing, but that was just a memory that you had. That they treated you good. They not only would they take you down there, they'd feed you, and then you'd get to go to those, Broadway plays, and then you'd get back. And
were they free of charge?
They were free. USO would get tickets, and once I went to Sardi's, which was next door to the Waldorf Astoria, to see Arthur Treacher when. There used to be a show, I think it was Joey Bishop and Arthur Treacher. That was like Johnny Carson and his side. But yeah, I had a lot of good memories from New York City. A lot of not so good memories, but nothing terrible. But it was such a big and cold place, and people weren't friendly. And you could see people laying on the streets, and nobody would go to try to help them. And when you're from West Virginia, you're not used to that. But yeah, that was another sidelight of being stationed there.
During your military service, did you have any memorable experiences with any other West Virginians?
No, I was the only person from West Virginia. I had some really good friends from, one boy was from Hammond, Indiana, and we stayed in touch. And then I had another fellow from Vermont, and then I had a friend from Pittsburgh, and him and I, a couple years after I got out of service, I would still see him. We went to a couple Steeler games even. That's when the Steelers had Mean Joe Green, and that's when they were winning Super Bowls. And there was one boy from West Virginia when I got drafted and ended up in basic training with him. Really two, but they didn't go to MP school, but then I lost track with the West Virginia fellas. I don't know which way they ended up going.
Okay. Were you able to make use of the GI Bill?
Yes, I did. When I got out of the service, as I said, I worked like midnight for several years in a row to get an MBA. Well, a couple of years out of the service, really, while I was still in the Army, I wanted to take the GMAT, and it wasn't the GMAT then, the Graduate Management Admissions Test. It was called the ATGSB, Admission Test for Graduate Study in Business, and they offered it at Fordham. And there was a friend of mine that came up from West Virginia and spent a weekend with me and he drove me to New York City to take that test. I worked midnight, and we went down there and had to be there, and his car didn't have reverse in it, and you know what it's like to be in New York City without reverse. And I took that test, and I'd worked midnight, and I did okay. I got in graduate school, but I was borderline, and you had to pass the first 12 hours or because I was on that test score. And but yeah, and then once I got back in civilian life, I got into the MBA program at WVU, and I started taking classes, and I used every bit of that GI. I'm probably the most educated person there is. After I finished the MBA, I started. They didn't have a doctoral program at WVU, just in economics. So I was working on a doctoral in safety, and I took all those classes until they did a moratorium on it. And then I was working on a doctoral thing in technology, and but I ended up after I used all the GI Bill, a few years later, getting the doctor's, the PhD in management, but I had to pay for that one. But I used every penny of the GI Bill.
Okay. Have you made use of any of the VA services?
Yes, when I first when I worked at Wheeling Steel after I got out of the service, and I worked there for like 10 years. Their benefits were like communism. You know, all three of my children cost 50 cents when they were born. You had to pay for the telephone in the room, and you know, your dentist and eye care was kind of free. But then when that plant closed and I got a job at Salem College, it was totally different. I ended up making a lot less money, and you didn't have benefits, and so I really didn't want to pay. So I started to use the VA. You know, I got in back in those days, in the early 80s, it wasn't. Today it's very efficient. You have your doctors and you're on a certain team, blue team or gold. Then you just went and waited all day. But I started to use the medical benefits then because I really just didn't think I could afford to go pay for them, because everything was kind of, you know, if you were willing to go. And I've always been treated well by the VA, and I still go to them. And I had eye surgery here back in August. It would have probably cost $20,000 that, you know, that the VA paid for. I mean, they use your PEIA insurance that you have, but then you don't have to make up the difference. You know, like if for you, if you were to go to the doctor, you would have to pay extra on top of, you know, the deductibles and everything. So yeah, so I use the medical insurance all the time, and again, it's very good. Like I had my eye surgery at Ruby. You know, if they can't do it there at the VA facility, they send you to, you know, I went to a sleep clinic at well, that was at a VA in Pittsburgh, but they do take care of. You know, they do a very good job about trying to take care of the veterans.
Okay. Looking back on related to your military service, would you have done anything differently? Would you have stayed in, or?
Well, I think when I got out, I guess I was on the active reserves for 4 years and don't even remember it. And then they never activated the reserves like they did today. You know, today if you're in the reserves, you can probably done 3 tours in Iraq or something.
Yes.
Then you really, but I wish that I would have stayed in the reserves. Part of me does, because, you know, I've been out of the service for 40 years, and, you know, 20 years ago I could have started probably getting some type of military thing if I would have stayed in the reserves and went to the, I mean, you'd have to go every 2 weeks to the training and go to meetings, but part of me, not out of patriotism, but out of economics, wished I would have stayed in the reserves, because but I never really gave it a thought. When I got out of there, I was thinking I was done with the service, and I didn't. And I'm sure I got the letter saying you can activate your reserve status if you want, but I don't even remember that. But so no, I never. If I had to do it over again, I think I would have stayed in the reserves. And that was your original question. But when you're 20 years old or 22 years old, you're not thinking when you're what's going to be like when you're 40 years old here.
Okay. Is there any advice that you would give to individuals that are currently in the military or thinking about joining the military?
Well, the ones that are currently in the military, I mean, they can probably give me advice, and you know, and I tell them I'm proud of them. But I tell lots of kids here at Glenville, and I've had a few takers, that if I didn't know what I wanted to do and I was 21, 22 years old, I would definitely think about going into service for 2 or 3 years, and not only for the long-term benefits, but I think it really helps you appreciate all the freedoms you have and think a lot. And I think that you know, I've never known of anybody that got out of the service that's regretted it. You know, I've talked to hundreds of people over the years, and even though it might not be fun at the time, you know, it makes I'm probably a chauvinist term, but it makes a man out of you. I grew up a lot from the first couple years when you think that the world kind of owes you a lot, and then you get in there and you. So I encourage students all the time that if you know, don't discount the service, because it's you know, it's really a good career, and I've told kids of mine, neighborhood, you know, that I watched go to church, that they never really went to college, but they were just struggling. And I talked one boy into it, and he's not come back to tell me, but he didn't have anything. And I talked to him. I said, "Why don't you do?" And he joined the Navy, and you know, him and his wife both lived 50 miles from Walmart, and they both worked at Walmart, but Walmart wouldn't give him the same shift, so he would go at 8 in the morning to 4, and she'd have to go with him, and he'd have to stay there till 10 at night because they worked. And I said, "That's no life for you. Why don't you join the service or something?" And they finally took me up on it, and so he'll have a nice career. I'm not sure what his MOS was, you know, what he was going to, but so I think it's a very good, you know, I believe in it.
Okay. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, you know, I can't really think of anything. When I was in basic training, my best friend that I grew up with, you know, we used to play ball together, and he got killed in Vietnam, and I was in basic training, and that really bothered me. And then, you know, and I wasn't bitter, but you know, he was smart, but he just quit college because he didn't know what he was doing, and then he got drafted. This was in the height of Vietnam, and then, and that's always bothered me to this day. Not anything against the service, but that he got, that was close to home, you know. And then another one of my best friends, and I went to his funeral last year, and he was a couple years older than me, but when he was in the service, he saw a lot of stuff in Vietnam, and for every year, for years out, he would end up having to go into the hospital with nervous problems, and you know, and he just wasn't. And again, I have nothing against the service, but those are two things that I think about, that old Joey Perito got killed, and Dick Boyd, and two of my best buddies, that, you know, he died at age 60 and years before he should have, and can't say it was because of the military, but he had lots of bad memories, and he'd have to go up there and, you know, for where they did people with nervous problems, and he was never able to really hold a job down or anything for any period of time, you know. But you know, I know other people that the best thing that ever happened to them in the service, and I think it was the best thing, not the best thing that ever happened to me, but I have no regrets. I've used that GI Bill. I still go to the VA. I know that someday, no matter how tough things get, and I always have a place where I can get medical help, or maybe even go into a rest home someday. Who knows? And so I think that the veterans or the military really take care of their own, and I believe in that with all my heart, and I have more respect for those people than anybody in the world that are in Afghanistan right now, or still in Iraq or something, and, because they're paying the ultimate price for you and I to sit here and talk, aren't they?
Yes.
And we don't really, we take that for granted.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for participating in this project, and I especially want to thank you for your service to our country, sir.
Well, I appreciate that, and I thank you.